So today is the big day. I'm going to install the transmission. I had previous footage that I was going to make another video out of, and it was really just about fitment and cleaning the transmission and inventorying some parts that I needed. But all the data and all the footage got corrupt when I was rendering it, so I wasn't able to make a video out of it. But if you see, the transmission now is all shiny and clean, and it does look like it's going to fit up. So here I grab a clutch fork and throwout bearing. Now I know these things are used and they look really bad, but they aren't, and at least the bearing wasn't making any noise. And really though, I'm just going from here and seeing how this transmission acts with this car and what I can do and change later on. Hopefully one day get the dog leg in there, but for right now I just want to get the car back on the road. Here I use a soft piece of wood to tap in the clutch pivot pin. I know it looks like I'm beating on the thing, but it's not getting hurt at all. And this is the best way I found to install these. I then cleaned up the clutch fork with a little bit of brake clean, just clean off the old clutch material that was on there. And I just looked around and make sure it wasn't cracked or bent anywhere. A thin coat of grease on the clutch pivot pin goes a long way. It prevents a squeak when you push in the clutch pedal. Then I also just put a thin coat of grease on the clutch fork and the throwout bearing. The trans is all complete and ready to be installed. Then I also grabbed a guibo and I torqued down 3 of the bolts. It makes it a lot easier than having to do all 6 under the car. Since my jack stands don't go all that high, I was able to squeak the transmission underneath the car like sideways and then tilted it back up on this piece of wood. And then I slid under my floor jack, or transmission floor jack, and I was able to jack up the transmission into place. I wish I was able to capture it on video, but I got the transmission in, and really, a couple people have asked me this in the past, how do I make it easier to put a transmission in on these cars? And it's just a matter of like tilting it side to side, back and forth, giving it a push up, push down. It also helps to shift the shifter a little bit because it causes the input shaft to be able to turn or not turn. And there's just a couple little tricks here and there, but I was able to click it into place and able to start bolting it up. I saved the bolts and hardware for mounting the transmission from a parts run that I had made, and here's just some little footage of me cleaning them up and laying them out on some paper towel. With the trans bolted up onto the engine, I slid the floor jack out of the way. Then I used my small floor jack to support the bottom of the transmission and start bringing it up so I could put the cross member in place. I had all but one bolt for the transmission. Luckily, though, this one was on the bottom, so I will order the correct one. The cross member from the white 528i bolted right up to the transmission and the body, and I was super happy because there were mixed opinions at whether or not it had that style of cross member. I bolted up the cross member too early. I jacked up the transmission, bolted it on, torqued everything down, and then realized, oh crap, I need to get the bitch clip out and still be able to mount the shifter carrier. So I had to drop back down the cross member, put on the shifter stuff, then put it back up and torque it in place. Alright, so back on. I got the transmission in the car, so that's a really good thing. I ordered some parts from the dealer and they showed up, and I got the shift shaft seal I needed. At least I think it's the right size one, right? But there's a bushing on the front of the shifter right. Let me Just turn on my lights. Right here, right? That's the bushing that I need. And somehow, this is the bushing for that. So clearly there's a mistake, and I'm gonna go run to the dealer right now and see if I can get this bushing, because this is the only thing that's holding us up from getting the shifter back in the car and getting the car back on the road. So I'm gonna go sort that out and I'll be back. The dealer gave me the same nonsense story that they gotta order something and it's gonna take days to show up. So I said, you know what, screw it. I'm just gonna keep the same bushing in there. It should be okay. Next though, I grabbed my pick set and I started poking away at the shift shaft seal. Be gentle and take your time with these. They eventually come out. I then pushed the car into 4th gear to get the shifter shaft as small as possible, laid the seal in place, and tapped it on with the socket. With the shift shaft seal in place, I then had to drop the cross member again because the bitch clip was hitting against the trans tunnel. I mounted the shifter carrier in place and then realized the back end of this is split. Another setback. Now I assume that the previous owner of the transmission and shifter just kind of dropped the entire carrier with it still in that back bushing, and it split and cracked there because these are cast aluminum. I'm not exactly sure though. Just a little bit too short to reach the back bushing, but I have an idea to fix that. You know, you always hate to have spare old parts lying around, but in situations like this, they absolutely save you. So there's the cracked one, and then this is one that's out of actually an E39. So my plan is to actually cut the back section off of the E39 one and run a bolt through both of them and mount the part onto the broken E28 one. Here we go. First, smooth out the rear section with a grinder and save as much material as you possibly can. Use an automatic center punch to make sure that you're dead set in the center of the shifter carrier, and start by drilling a small hole. Then you work your way up to the final drill size in order for you to be able to tap this. One important thing to remember with cast aluminum is that it cracks very easily, so go slow and be gentle as you work. I then used the bolt that I had left over from one of the spare junk cars and ran the threads as far as I could into the shifter carrier. Now it's time to cut this one. I then used the file to completely flatten it out and clean up the rough edges. happy to say it fits pretty good. The final fitment, and it's mint. The seam where the two pieces join, I figured to braze it. You have real two choices when you're repairing cast aluminum, either TIG weld it or braze it, and since I didn't have a TIG welder, I chose to braze it. I mounted it back up, and it turned out to be the perfect size to fit into the bushing. This bushing is clipped into place by just using a sharp pair of needle nose pliers and twisting it until it locks under these two tabs. Then the shifter is in, and you're good to go for that part. Everything's in, but something didn't seem quite right. I was looking at the linkage, and it just seems too close to the guibo in order for the guibo to spin. And actually, online there was a forum post that the Bentley Manual and RealOEM.com, all the sites that have the diagram of the shifter assembly, showed the shifter linkage wrong, and it showed it 180 degrees out. And here's the picture of what I found, but that's just something to take into consideration when installing these. It was a quick fix just to flip those things around. I'm really glad that I found that before I installed the drive shaft. This looks a lot better now that that's flipped around. The next order of business was to replace this old broken slave cylinder. If you see the piece of paper towel on the floor, that's the color of the brake fluid that was coming out of the old slave cylinder, so I'm glad I replaced this. Bleeding the slave cylinder is another tricky task with BMWs, but you get into a rhythm of it. If you see what I'm doing, I open the bleeder, push the plunger, close the bleeder, let go of the plunger, and repeat. And it eventually pulls air out of the system and starts pulling fluid down from the master cylinder and the brake fluid reservoir up top. I couldn't figure out why I was getting no fluid down to the slave, and it just turned out to be a fluid reservoir that was just slightly low. And keep bleeding it until you see no more air and just a constant stream of fluid coming out of the bleeder. Then I mounted the slave cylinder to the transmission using the two studs that are mounted up there. The backstory with this car is that it sat for a little while, and with that broken slave cylinder, all the air worked its way into the pedal. And I'm not kidding you, just pump the crap out of the pedal and eventually you'll start building a pedal back up. And it was a matter of pulling fluid down from the reservoir down to the pedal box. Then I mounted the output flange and guibo to the transmission and put it on with an impact gun. I almost forgot to add one thing. With these guibos and these transmissions, you gotta have all 6 bolts in order for you to be able to even get the drive shaft in place. Now this drive shaft is just slightly short, but luckily I had one laying around and I was able to use the front half and then made it to the rear half of the original drive shaft. I need this one's front half. Due to old grease and corrosion, these are not easy to split, at least mine weren't. I was able to finally get it after using some heat and a little bit of aerocroil as the penetrant. The nut finally broke loose after I used a much hotter torch. This was a MAP and Oxy torch, and I was able to get the nut to crack loose. I was able to finally split the two pieces of drive shaft and keep the front part that I needed. The center support bearing that's on this front part of this drive shaft is no longer good. It's all egg-shaped, it's bent, and the bearing's making some noise. So that's the only thing that's holding this whole project up right now. I have the part on order. It should be here Tuesday, May 29th, if not the latest, Wednesday the 30th. And then the drive shaft should go in, and hopefully I can start getting this car back on the road. The one other thing that I also need is an exhaust, but I'm starting to source out some parts for that, so hopefully I'll have that back together. Other than that, thanks for tuning in today. I know this was a long video, but a lot of information in this. So thanks for watching, and have a good day. Bye.